All right, this is chapter 14, and we're going to be looking at environmental issues and human health. The case study is about BPA. BPA stands for bisphenol A, and it's a chemical used to make hard, clear plastic. It's also used as a slick lining to the inside of many canned goods. And also, the slick feeling you feel on a cash register receipt is from BPA. It's an example of an endocrine disruptor which can mimic the body's hormones. It can end up causing cancer, nerve damage, and miscarriages. We're going to talk a little bit more about it later in the notes. We all have it in our body, and if you drank from a bottle when you were a baby, it was probably even in your baby bottle. But in 2012 in the US, it was banned for any products meant for babies and toddlers. Other countries such as Canada have taken a much firmer stance on BPA. In the US, many companies have removed it from their water bottles due to consumer demand. Unfortunately, the bad news is that one of the most common replacement materials, called BPS, may actually have more severe health effects. So we're going to talk about 4 categories of environmental health hazards really briefly. The first one would be physical hazards such as severe weather events. Next would be chemical hazards, both synthetic and natural, and then biological hazards, including infectious diseases. And finally, cultural hazards such as lifestyle choices, including smoking, diet, lack of exercise, and crime. How about that cheeseburger? We may be exposed to indoor health hazards in our home or workplaces and not even know it, including exposure to radon and asbestos. Radon is a radioactive gas that seeps out of some rock, soil, and water, and unfortunately, it's very common in our area. You can see on the map, Douglas County is a hotspot. It can also come from granite countertops inside your home. It is the second leading cause of lung cancer after smoking. It tends to build up in homes with basements that are tightly sealed, but luckily testing for radon is fairly inexpensive and mitigation is not all that expensive. Typically, a pipe is built to vent it out of the house. Asbestos is a material made of microscopic fibers that can cause scarring of your lung tissues when inhaled, and this is called asbestosis. Asbestos was used extensively in older homes, in ceilings, floor tiles, and even paint as a fireproofing agent. The last asbestos mine in the US was closed in 2002, but many older buildings still have asbestos. We had a lot of asbestos in our school building, and they had to do a lot of mitigation during construction. So if you have asbestos in your home, you should always hire a professional to remove it because it is hazardous, and sometimes it's just better to cover it up rather than removing it because the particles become airborne once you start messing with them. Lead is a naturally occurring heavy metal that's linked to damage to the brain, liver, kidney, stomach, and can cause learning disabilities and death. A person can be exposed through flowing water, through lead pipes, such as the tragedy we've witnessed in Flint, Michigan, or a baby eating lead paint chips in an older home, or chewing on a toy painted with lead paint. Lead ammunition has led to the decline and near extinction of the California condor because it builds up in their bodies when they eat prey that has been shot by hunters. In terms of environmental health considerations, disease is a major focus. Disease can be genetic or environmental in nature. It can be classified as infectious, like COVID or malaria, or non-infectious, such as heart disease or cancer. Infectious disease typically kills about 15 million people per year. But of course, in our current pandemic, we're contributing about 2 million extra deaths from last year alone because of COVID. On the flip side, influenza is down because of masking and social distancing, so it may all balance out. Poverty and low-income areas often struggle with sanitation and clean water, which can lead to an increase in infectious disease. Lifestyle choices can increase disease. For example, in the US, smoking has decreased while obesity has increased. Over 42% of Americans are classified as obese, which makes them more vulnerable to multiple diseases. Unfortunately, you are all real-time experts in the spread of infectious disease right now. We know that global travel increases spread, and new diseases will continue to emerge in areas that are deforested, and the climate is changing, and all of these changes can lead to these new emerging diseases. We're going to switch gears and talk about toxins in our environment. We did our lab this week looking at household hazards, so you have a little background knowledge in this area already. Before we go on, I had a great conversation with our hybrid learners about how everything's a trade-off. You have to decide when you're buying a cleaning product, is it worth the risk of exposure to some chemical for the cleaning power you get and the amount of exposure you will get? We get to make choices about our lifestyles, but we're also limited by cost and availability of alternatives. But educating yourself is the best way to go about this. We all know that human-made chemicals are in many of our bodies and bodies of water, and also our physical bodies. We're going to talk more about water pollution in an upcoming water unit, so we'll circle back to that then. All of us are born with synthetic chemicals already in us. We have to remember that they're not all harmful. The book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson led to an environmental awakening and the revolution at the grassroots level of Americans demanding that we deserve to have clean air and water. DDT was the chemical that was featured in her book. It was subsequently banned in the US in 1973 for manufacturing, although we still do make it and send it to other nations. I actually worked in a greenhouse in Texas in the 1990s, and the owner still had a reserve stock of DDT on hand. And the story behind DDT was that it was an herbicide, but it was getting into the food chain and it was causing the birds of prey to have weak eggs in a reduced population. There are many different classes of toxicants that can affect humans. Carcinogens causing cancer, mutagens causing mutations, teratogens cause birth defects, allergens causing allergic reactions, and endocrine disruptors disrupting and affecting the endocrine system. There's some horrendous stories of just common everyday drugs that were used in the 1950s and 60s that caused all kinds of horrific birth defects. So you can read a little bit more about those if you're interested. Look up thalidomide. As mentioned before, endocrine disruptors mimic hormones and fool the body. They can lead to birth defects, developmental disorders, and gender imbalances in wildlife species such as fish. We already talked about BPA being an endocrine disruptor, but another example would be phthalates. They are found in many of our body care products and toys, and in many of our soft plastics. They make plastics soft and flexible. Toxins in the environment might end up in water. And again, we're going to talk more about this in our water unit. Many of the aquatic organisms are affected by these toxins, and they might be an indicator of trouble, such as this frog that has grown too many legs. Toxins such as pesticides can also travel with air currents. We call this pesticide drift. Sadly, even polar bears are known to be contaminated with pesticides that are not used where they live. Some toxins take longer than others to break down and may persist in the environment, such as DDT. And we're going to talk a little bit more about these persistent toxins in a bit. Some toxins build up in the bodies of living organisms. This is called bioaccumulation. The higher these toxins go on the food chain, the more magnified they become in the bodies of the top predators. So, for example, this osprey is eating so many contaminated fish and plankton that it's taking in large quantities of the toxins, which has led to the near extinction of some birds. Mercury is an example of a toxin that's known to bioaccumulate and biomagnify. I like this visual diagram to help you see the difference between bioaccumulation, which follows the toxins in the body of one organism over time as it grows and develops, versus biomagnification as we watch how the toxin is passed through a food chain to the top predator and becomes more concentrated in the body of those top predators. There are also natural toxins out there. If you come to my room in person, I have an awesome huge poster in my front window showing biological toxins that are found on Earth naturally, including fungal toxins and shellfish toxins. We can understand the impact of a toxin by using a standard test called the LD50 test, which stands for lethal dose 50%, the point at which the toxin kills half of the test subjects. So that's what we did with our seeds and our salt. We found the point at which 50% of our seeds did not germinate because of the salt level, and we called that our LD50 for the salt. When it comes to regulating environmental hazards or toxins, some countries like the US take the innocent until proven guilty approach. But most European nations have a more strict precautionary principle approach, meaning it has to be proven harmless before it can be used. In the US, the Food and Drug Administration and the EPA regulate food safety, drugs, and chemicals. Be sure and add this information to your notes, as it is one of the 10 environmental laws you're going to need to know for the AP test. The Delaney Clause of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is a federal law that basically says you can't add things to food that cause cancer. There's a class of chemicals identified by United Nations at the Stockholm Convention called POPs, persistent organic pollutants. They do not break down easily, and they tend to bioaccumulate and biomagnify in organisms. All 12 of these POPs are endocrine disruptors, and they may travel a far distance by wind or water. They include DDT, which we already talked about, but also PCBs, which come primarily from old electrical equipment, and some plastics. Even though these were banned in the US in 1979, there's still high concentrations of them in the fish of the Kansas River. So you should not eat more than one meal of Kansas River fish per week, especially bottom dwellers. So international and federal agencies can produce guidelines for environmental toxins, but ultimately it's up to you to be informed as a consumer to balance the risks and the hazards with your informed choice.